Alvarius can't make it, but he's recorded a video for us, and then we'll have other members of the core dev team stick around after for a Q&A session. So before we move forward to the update, just want to quickly remind everyone that if you do want to be more community-based announcements at the end, but for now, we'll just get right back into the video playback for Alvarius presenting.
All right, let's get into the core dev update. Let me start with a huge announcement. The audit of the MUD contracts and CodeGen is complete. OpenZeppelin spent multiple months going through the entire contract and CodeGen codebase. We were in close contact with them the entire time, and they just sent us the final report this week, and we're going to publish it soon. This means we can now recommend the contracts for production use. The contracts that are currently on the main branch and in the latest pre-release are audited. However, one caveat is we don't have a stable release yet, and that is because we release both the contract and the client SDKs with one shared version. And stable release here means no more breaking changes. So you can already expect no more breaking changes on the contract side, but we still have a few things that we want to get into the client SDK, which is why we're not calling it stable yet. I'll talk a little bit more about the things we want to get into the client SDK before cutting the stable release. But before that, let me quickly talk about some recent breaking changes that were part of the audit fixes. The first one is system names are no longer part of non-root function selectors. But let me break that down. In a MUD world, anyone can register a new system and new function selector. And by anyone, we mean it can be different parties who register systems in the same world. And to avoid collisions of function selectors between those systems, the function selectors on the world are prefixed with the namespace. Previously, the prefix also included the system name, but to improve the ergonomics of using this, we removed the system name. And to prevent collisions, we made the separator 2 underscores, and namespaces can't include 2 subsequent underscores anymore. Now you might be thinking, I never had to prefix my function selectors, and that is because there is an exception for root systems, which are those systems that only the owner of the root namespace, so usually the creator of the world, can register. And currently the default in MUD is to use the root namespace, but we want to change that going forward. The reasons for this are, function selectors are not the only exception for root systems. There's a bunch more exceptions, which make root systems very powerful, but also very dangerous. And the other reason is, root systems undermine the philosophy of MUD that there should not be a difference between first-party and third-party creators. And so going forward, the default will be regular non-root namespaces. You can of course still use the root namespace if you need to and if you know what you're doing, but we don't want to make it the default, similar to how you shouldn't use the root user on a Linux machine by default. Now the next breaking change is also related to namespaces. Previously, registering systems and registering tables implicitly also registered a namespace if the namespace didn't exist yet. However, that would have made a front-running attack possible. The front-running attack would have worked as follows. You would try to register a namespace, a table in a namespace that doesn't exist yet, and then an attacker could front-run this transaction to create the namespace, give himself access to it, and then transfer ownership of that namespace to you. Now that would have meant that your table registration transaction is still successful because you now own the namespace, but the attacker also has access to it. To prevent that, we now require namespaces to already exist when you register a table or a system. That means you own the namespace, you registered it because you explicitly did so with the register namespace function call, and then the register system or register table call only succeeds if you own the namespace. If you're using the MUD deploy CLI, there's no action required because this change is already integrated in there. But if you're registering tables or systems manually via Solidity, then you might have to first register a namespace now. Those were the main breaking changes, but as always, you can check out the detailed changelog with all the changes and detailed upgrade instructions at mud.dev/changelog. And now let's look at the next milestone, the stable release. I briefly mentioned this earlier. By stable release, we mean a release after which you can expect no more breaking changes. Now I want to give you a quick insight into the things we still want to get in the client SDK before that stable release. First, we have the strongly typed query interface. Mud currently supports a number of query interfaces. There's RECS for ECS queries on the client, there's Zustand on the client for a more React Native state management, and there's of course the indexer, which also allows some basic queries. But all in all, the types of queries that you can run on each of these is different. Some of them support composite keys and others don't, like RECS, and some have stronger types than others. What we want to get to is an API that you can use to query on the client and from the indexer with strong type and composite key support, with support for ECS queries, and with support for streaming queries, so that's queries that you can subscribe to for updates. And we have an API spec in the making, and we'll share it on GitHub once it's ready, and we'll notify you on Discord as well. And then the other thing that we still want to get in before the stable release is the final form of the Mud config. There are two things here that we want to improve, and the first thing is support for multiple namespaces, which unlocks a simpler workflow for extending existing worlds. And the other thing we want to add is support for plugins that can extend the config types, which will then allow additional functionality to be added by third-party devs without breaking changes. And we also have a spec for this ready to share on GitHub very soon, and then also will notify you on Discord. There are a few more breaking changes that we want to get in before the stable release, and you can follow along all the details and all our progress on roadmap.mud.dev, which redirects you to a GitHub project. And overall, we're trying to front load every breaking change that we still have planned to the next couple of weeks, so that we get to the stable release as soon as possible, and once we're there, you can enjoy no more breaking changes. And with that, I'll hand it back to...
All right. Well, awesome. There it is. That's the presentation from Flo, even though he's